Welcome, friend, to Midnight History for Sleep. Tonight, we'll drift through the sweeping story of Canada, its ancient landscapes, its first peoples, and the centuries of journeys that shaped this vast and peaceful land. Before we set sail across time, take a slow breath in and let it go. If you enjoy relaxing histories like this, remember to tap like and subscribe so more soothing journeys can find you whenever you need them. Now, settle into comfort. Close your eyes, if you wish, and imagine the northern lights shimmering overhead. Let the quiet rhythm of history guide you gently toward rest as we begin the entire history of Canada. The story of Canada begins long before anyone ever called it Canada, before flags and borders, before European ships cut across the Atlantic or surveyors traced maps on parchment. It begins in a time so vast that human memory itself seems small beside it. Imagine, for a moment, a continent sculpted by ice and time, a landscape of quiet power. Tens of thousands of years ago, during the last ice age, immense sheets of ice, some more than 2 kilometers thick, covered what is now North America. These glaciers moved with patient certainty, grinding mountains into valleys, carving the Great Lakes, pressing the earth into new shapes. Beneath their frozen weight, the bedrock that would one day be called Canada was hidden, silent, waiting. When the climate slowly warmed, the glaciers began to melt and retreat, leaving behind a land of raw beauty. Freshwater lakes so clear they mirrored the sky, forests that stretched unbroken from horizon to horizon, and rivers that wound like silver threads through plains of wild grass. Life returned gradually. First came the plants that could endure the cold: mosses, lichens, small hardy flowers. Then the animals followed: mighty woolly mammoths, shaggy musk oxen, and herds of caribou. The air carried the cry of giant birds. Streams filled with fish, and the forests thickened into boreal expanses of spruce and pine. By around 12 to 15,000 years ago, people were moving across this reawakening land. These first humans were skilled travelers and keen observers of nature. Many scholars believe their ancestors crossed from Asia into North America by way of a land bridge that once connected Siberia and Alaska, a bridge exposed when sea levels were lower. Others propose that some arrived along the Pacific coastline in boats, following the rich marine life of the ocean's edge. However they came, they found a continent that invited adaptation and ingenuity. Archaeological sites like Bluefish Caves in the Yukon and the ancient camp at Haida Gwaii whisper of these earliest inhabitants. Stone tools, fragments of bone, traces of fire, each artifact is a quiet testimony to lives lived in tune with the seasons. These people knew how to read the land. They learned when the salmon would run, where berries ripened in the brief northern summer, how to track the movement of caribou herds across tundra and forest. As millennia passed, diverse cultures flourished across the immense geography. In the west, along the Pacific coast, the ancestors of the Haida, Tlingit, and Coast Salish developed sophisticated fishing techniques and built great cedar houses decorated with totem poles that told stories of lineage and spirit. Farther inland, on the plateaus and prairies, nations like the Blackfoot, Cree, and Assiniboine followed the rhythms of the bison herds and crafted complex social networks to share knowledge and trade. To the east, the Iroquoian peoples, ancestors of the Haudenosaunee, cultivated the Three Sisters of maize, beans, and squash, establishing vibrant agricultural communities. Along the Atlantic, the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Innu paddled sleek birch-bark canoes through waterways that laced the forested coasts, living in harmony with tides and seasons. Each region fostered distinct languages, spiritual beliefs, and technologies, but a common thread ran through them all: a deep respect for the land and its cycles. Stories were passed orally, carrying wisdom across generations. The stars guided travel, the winds and animals gave warning of weather, and ceremonies honored the interconnectedness of all life. By the time European explorers first glimpsed these shores, millions of indigenous people lived in what is now Canada, speaking hundreds of languages and maintaining trade routes that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific and into the Arctic. These were not isolated groups but vibrant nations, each with governance systems, art, and diplomacy. Wampum belts recorded agreements, potlatch ceremonies celebrated abundance and community responsibility, intricate beadwork and carvings preserved cultural memory. The land itself remained a central character in this story. Picture the endless northern forests of spruce and birch, where snow muffled the sound of footsteps. Picture the prairie grass bending under a steady wind, the sparkle of 1,000 rivers tumbling toward the sea, the red sandstone cliffs of Prince Edward Island glowing at sunset. For thousands of years, people moved through these landscapes with an intimacy that outsiders would struggle to understand. Seasons turned like a slow wheel. In spring, rivers swelled with meltwater, and families gathered for fishing and planting. Summer brought long days for hunting and trade, while autumn meant harvest and preparation. Winter demanded resilience and cooperation, fireside storytelling, and the patient work of crafting tools and clothing. These ancient rhythms shaped a civilization as complex and enduring as any in the world. When we speak of the history of Canada, it is important to remember that it does not begin with European arrival. It begins here, with the first peoples whose stewardship of the land stretches back beyond recorded time. As we drift toward the next chapter of this journey, hold that thought gently. Imagine the crackling of a fire beneath the northern sky alive with shimmering green auroras. Listen for the low beat of a drum echoing across the centuries. The land breathes, the people sing, and the story continues. The ancient heartbeat of the land continued for countless seasons after the first peoples settled from coast to coast. Generations were born and grew old beneath the endless northern skies. Far across the ocean, however, a different world was stirring. Sailors and storytellers in distant Europe were beginning to whisper of lands beyond the western horizon, of seas wider than imagination, and of opportunities wrapped in mist and myth. Centuries before Columbus, before French caravels or English merchant ships, seafarers from the north, Vikings or Norsemen, had already learned how to ride the restless Atlantic. Their homeland, a rugged sweep of fjords and mountains now called Norway, Iceland, and Greenland, bred sailors who read the wind and the stars as if they were a second language. Longships built of oak and pine, sleek and resilient, carried them to Iceland and then to Greenland. By the late 900s, these voyages were no longer legend but regular journeys of trade and settlement. Among these sailors was Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red. The old sagas tell of how Leif heard rumors from a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who claimed to have sighted strange wooded shores far west of Greenland. Drawn by curiosity and the promise of new timber for his people's sparse settlements, Leif set sail around the year 1000 CE. He and his crew found a land of meadows and rivers, where wild grapes, so rare to northern eyes, grew in abundance. They called it Vinland. Today, historians and archaeologists trace Leif's landing to the northern tip of Newfoundland, at a place we now know as L'Anse aux Meadows. There, the outlines of sod-walled halls still rest beneath the grass, silent witnesses to the earliest known European presence in what would one day be called Canada. Imagine the sounds: the creak of timber as longships touched shore, the hiss of a cold Atlantic wind, the crackle of a new fire built from driftwood. Norse voices rose in song beneath the aurora, while nearby, the ancestors of the Beotic people watched from the forest edge, alert to these strange newcomers. The Norse stayed only a few seasons. The sagas speak of skirmishes with the local inhabitants, called skrælings in Norse stories, of harsh winters and the difficulty of sustaining trade so far from their homelands. By about 1015, the small Vinland experiment was abandoned. Yet the encounter mattered. It left a faint but real imprint on both sides of the Atlantic. The Beothuk and other indigenous nations already had vast trade networks that stretched across the continent. Now, for a brief moment, they had glimpsed visitors from an entirely different world. For the next 500 years, the coasts of Canada remained largely unknown to Europe. But across the ocean, change brewed. Population growth strained resources. Maritime technology improved, sturdier hulls, triangular lateen sails that caught the wind more efficiently, compasses and maps that made sailors bolder. Monarchs and merchants hungered for spices, furs, and new trade routes to the riches of Asia. Rumors of distant islands, of cod-rich waters and lands of endless timber, drifted back with fishermen and wanderers. Curiosity sharpened into ambition. By the 15th century, Portuguese and Basque fishermen were quietly crossing the Atlantic in search of the enormous cod stocks off what we now call the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. They came in small numbers, leaving few written records, but archaeological hints, a nail here, a shard of pottery there, suggest their seasonal presence. These crews salted their catch on shore and sailed home before winter, rarely encountering indigenous communities inland. The ocean remained the great highway and barrier. As the 15th century ended, the great European powers, Spain, Portugal, England, France, turned their gaze westward with purpose. In 1497, the Venetian navigator John Cabot, sailing under the English flag, reached the coast of what he called New Found Land. He marveled at seas so thick with cod that, as sailors later boasted, one could almost scoop them up in baskets. Cabot's voyage would quietly seed England's future claims to North America. Meanwhile, stories of strange lands continued to spread. Sailors carried them to crowded markets and candlelit taverns. Mapmakers, hearing rumors of islands across the Western Sea, began sketching ghostly coastlines onto their parchment charts. Each line was both guesswork and invitation. Back in the lands we now call Canada, indigenous nations continued to flourish. The Mi'kmaq and Beothuk along the Atlantic coast watched foreign sails appear more frequently on the horizon. These early encounters were often fleeting, trading fish or iron tools for furs, yet they set patterns that would echo through centuries. Moments of cooperation shadowed by tension, curiosity mingled with caution. Farther north, the Inuit navigated icy waters in sleek kayaks, hunting seal and whale with unmatched skill. In the dense forests of the interior, Cree and Anishinaabe communities maintained their seasonal cycles of hunting, gathering, and ceremony, largely unaware of the growing European fascination with the lands they called home. The 16th century would soon bring explorers in greater numbers. Jacques Cartier would sail up the mighty river that would later bear the name St. Lawrence. French fishermen would establish more permanent camps. The slow tide of contact was beginning to rise. But here, as we pause, the world is still balanced between two eras. Europe is stirring with desire for discovery, yet Canada, this vast northern land of forests, rivers, and ancient peoples, remains largely untouched by outside influence. The aurora still dances above dark spruce, the caribou still cross endless tundra, and the songs of the first people still carry across cold, clear lakes. As you drift toward rest, imagine a moonlit Atlantic, silent except for the rhythmic splash of a wooden oar. Somewhere in that darkness, a Norse ship slides through mist. Far behind it, on the rugged shore of Newfoundland, the embers of a forgotten fire glow faintly in the night. The meeting of worlds has begun, quietly, like the first breath of dawn. The century turned and the wide northern world, so long known only to its first peoples, began to feel the slow approach of sails and ambition. Europe, restless and hungry for trade, gold, and glory, cast its eyes westward more intently than ever. The Norse voyages had faded into legend, and the occasional fishermen of Portugal and the Basque Country left few records, but their quiet visits were enough to spark rumors of endless fish, towering forests, and unknown riches. In France, a young and energetic kingdom eager to rival Spain and England sought a path to Asia that would avoid the long, contested routes around Africa or through the Mediterranean. The dream was a shortcut, a northwest passage through the lands that would one day be called Canada. Into this atmosphere of hope and competition stepped Jacques Cartier, a mariner from the rugged Breton coast. In 1534, backed by King Francis I, Cartier set out across the Atlantic with 2 sturdy ships and a crew hardened by the salt wind of the Channel. Their mission was to find a route to the riches of Cathay, the old European name for China, but also to claim new territory for France. After 3 weeks of rolling seas and relentless spray, Cartier sighted a coastline unlike anything he had known. A place of sharp cliffs and deep green forests, where seabirds wheeled above icy waves. He had reached the northern tip of what we now call Newfoundland. The Mi'kmaq and other indigenous nations watched the strange newcomers from a distance, their birch-bark canoes moving silently through sheltered coves. Cartier explored the Gulf of St. Lawrence, marveling at the vastness of the water and the rich fisheries that seemed to renew themselves endlessly. He planted a cross on the Gaspé Peninsula to signal France's claim, an act of European ceremony that the local Stadakanans, part of the larger Iroquoian-speaking peoples, observed with a mix of curiosity and caution. Cartier took 2 young Iroquoian men, Damagea and Tignoagny, back across the Atlantic, a gesture meant to impress his king but one that foreshadowed a long history of fraught exchanges between Europeans and the continent's first inhabitants. Cartier returned the following year with the larger expedition. Guided by the knowledge of the 2 young men he had taken to France and brought back, he sailed deeper into the mighty river they called the St. Lawrence. Here, the landscape unfolded in quiet grandeur, rolling hills of autumn forest, water so wide it seemed to merge with the sky, and villages of longhouses where smoke curled into the cool air. Cartier met Chief Donnacona at Stadacona, near present-day Quebec City, and learned of a larger settlement upriver called Hochelaga, today's Montreal. He continued to that island, where more than 1,000 people welcomed him with feasts of corn, fish, and game. Their society was complex, their fields carefully tended, their trade routes stretching far beyond the horizon. Cartier's journals, filled with wonder at their abundance, are among the earliest European records of the life and culture that had flourished here for countless generations. Yet winter descended with a harshness his sailors could scarcely imagine. The river froze solid, trapping the French ships in ice. Scurvy, the dreaded disease of vitamin deficiency, spread through the crew, twisting limbs with pain. Many would have died had the Stadakanans not offered a remedy, a tea brewed from the bark of the white cedar. It saved Cartier and his men, though relations with their hosts grew tense as supplies dwindled and misunderstandings multiplied. In the spring, Cartier prepared to return home, but before leaving he captured Donnacona and several others, carrying them to France in the hope that their tales of a land rich in gold and furs would inspire further royal support. None of these captives ever saw their homeland again. Cartier made a 3rd voyage in 1541, this time with plans for a permanent settlement. He chose a site upriver at Cap Rouge and named it Charlesbourg Royal. But the colony struggled. Conflicts with local nations, harsh weather, and a fruitless search for supposed diamonds and gold drained morale. The glittering stones they carried back to France proved to be worthless quartz, and the dream of a French colony faded, at least for a time. Still, Cartier's expeditions left a legacy that would shape the centuries to come. He had mapped the Gulf and the St. Lawrence with remarkable accuracy, given names to capes and bays, and established that a vast waterway led deep into the continent. French fishermen continued to frequent the cod-rich waters of Newfoundland and the Gulf, trading quietly with indigenous peoples for furs and supplies. The idea of a new France lingered in the minds of merchants and monarchs even as decades passed without another major attempt. While France hesitated, the First Peoples continued their own dynamic history. Along the St. Lawrence, Iroquoian villages shifted and evolved, some moving westward as trade patterns changed. Farther inland, the Anishinaabe maintained vast networks of exchange, their birch-bark canoes gliding across the endless freshwater seas of the Great Lakes. To the north, the Cree and Dean followed caribou across the tundra, while along the Pacific, the Haida and Coast Salish continued their rich artistic traditions of carving and ceremony. The arrival of Europeans, though sporadic, had already introduced new goods, metal tools, beads, and cloth, but also new challenges, including diseases that spread invisibly and would, over time, bring devastating losses. By the early 1600s, the pressure to expand returned. The fur trade, with its luxurious beaver pelts coveted in the fashion houses of Paris and London, promised enormous profit. Merchants petitioned the French crown for monopolies. Samuel de Champlain, a soldier, navigator, and diplomat, emerged as the figure who would turn Cartier's distant dream into reality. Champlain had sailed with an expedition to Acadia in 1604, establishing Port Royal in what is now Nova Scotia, and he would soon found a permanent settlement on the very cliffs where Donnacona's people once welcomed Cartier. That settlement, Quebec, would become the heart of New France. As you picture these events, imagine the slow rhythm of the river itself, the St. Lawrence wide and steady under the summer sun. Picture the quiet paddles of an Algonquin trading canoe as it glides past forested banks, the distant echo of a French musket shot testing the air. This is the threshold of a new era, where worlds would meet not in a single moment but in countless exchanges, gifts and bargains, alliances and conflicts, misunderstandings and occasional friendships. The French would bring iron, guns, and Christianity. The indigenous nations would offer knowledge of the land, routes through the interior, and the furs that would finance empires. Through it all, the land itself remained immense and untamed, its forests breathing beneath endless skies. The same northern lights that had shone over the first hunters and the Norse explorers still rippled silently overhead, indifferent to human ambition. As night falls across the river and the gentle lapping of water fills the darkness, the story of Canada stands at a turning point. The quiet centuries of Indigenous stewardship are meeting the restless currents of European desire, and the next chapters will tell of alliances, wars, and the fragile beginnings of a nation. As the years of the 16th century gave way to the 17th, the quiet northern world awaited the next wave of European settlement. Jacques Cartier had charted the St. Lawrence, brought tales of fish and forests back to France, and glimpsed the potential for trade and colonization. Yet it would be Samuel de Champlain, a navigator, cartographer, and diplomat, who would turn those early explorations into the foundation of a permanent French presence in what would become Canada. Champlain's voyages began in earnest in 1603, when he sailed up the St. Lawrence River with the goal of establishing trade networks and alliances with indigenous nations. He was a man of careful observation, recording in detail the landscapes, the people he encountered, and the resources that could sustain future settlers. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he understood that survival in this vast, unfamiliar land depended on cooperation with the people who already knew it. His journals describe the long houses of the Iroquoians, their ceremonies, and the extensive agricultural systems that allowed them to thrive in the river valley. He noted the forests and rivers that teemed with fish, the fertile fields, and the abundant game that roamed the forests and plains. In 1604, Champlain helped establish Port Royal in present-day Nova Scotia. This small settlement, nestled among rivers and rich farmland, became a testing ground for European methods of agriculture, trade, and diplomacy in the New World. The settlers faced hardships: cold winters, unfamiliar soil, and scarce supplies. But they also learned from the Mi'kmaq people, who taught them how to grow native crops and navigate the forests. Over time, these lessons would prove invaluable. By 1608, Champlain had chosen a more strategic location for a permanent settlement along the St. Lawrence River. The site, known today as Quebec City, overlooked the river from a high cliff, providing natural defense and access to inland trade routes. The first winter was harsh, with snow piled high and temperatures dropping far below anything the settlers had experienced in Europe. Yet Champlain's careful planning and his alliances with local nations, including the Algonquin, Montagnais, and Huron, allowed the settlement to survive. He traded European goods for furs, particularly beaver pelts, which were highly prized back in France, and in return offered tools, cloth, and iron implements. Champlain was not only a founder and leader, but also a mediator. The St. Lawrence region was home to complex networks of nations, each with their own alliances, rivalries, and trade systems. Champlain learned to navigate these relationships, often participating in joint military ventures with his Indigenous allies against rival groups, such as the Iroquois Confederacy. These alliances were delicate, requiring understanding, respect, and sometimes compromise. The success of New France depended not solely on European resolve but on Indigenous knowledge, diplomacy, and willingness to engage in mutual benefit. The settlement grew slowly but steadily. Buildings of wood and stone rose along the cliffside, forming streets, houses, and small fortifications. Gardens and farms began to produce vegetables, while livestock introduced from Europe supplemented the settlers' diet. Each summer, fur traders and explorers set out into the vast interior, traveling along rivers and lakes that indigenous peoples had navigated for centuries, establishing temporary posts and returning with furs that would sustain the economy of New France. Champlain himself explored extensively. He paddled canoes along the Ottawa River, journeyed to Lake Huron and Lake Ontario, and mapped the lands he traversed with meticulous care. His records of topography, settlements, and peoples remain invaluable historical sources today, providing insight into both European and Indigenous life at the time. He witnessed the seasonal rhythms of hunting, fishing, and agriculture, recording how rivers teemed with fish, forests yielded nuts and berries, and the land provided for those who understood its cycles. Yet life in New France was not without hardship. Winters were long and unforgiving, often cutting off supply routes from Europe. Disease, including smallpox and scurvy, could strike with little warning, claiming lives and threatening the survival of the community. The settlers had to adapt European methods of building, farming, and survival to a new climate and a new environment. They learned to store food for the winter, to hunt and fish in coordination with indigenous practices, and to maintain homes against the bitter cold. Every small success, from a thriving crop to a safe winter, became a testament to resilience and ingenuity. Champlain also understood the importance of recording history. His journals are filled with careful descriptions of ceremonies, trade, battles, and daily life. He documented the names of villages, the practices of nations, and the land's features, including rivers, forests, and lakes. These records would later serve not only as guides for other settlers but as an enduring chronicle of the early interactions between Europeans and the first peoples of the St. Lawrence Valley. Over time, the fur trade became the lifeblood of New France. Traders traveled deeper into the interior, often relying on indigenous knowledge to navigate rivers, build canoes, and establish routes to distant territories. Trade goods flowed in both directions: European metal tools, cloth, and firearms in exchange for beaver pelts, furs, and local knowledge. The economy of New France was thus inseparable from the alliances and relationships it maintained with indigenous nations. Mutual dependence shaped both diplomacy and daily life. Religion also played a central role. Missionaries, often Jesuits, accompanied settlers to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. Their writings reveal both admiration and misunderstanding of indigenous culture, describing ceremonies and spiritual practices that were deeply connected to land, family, and the cycles of life. Though their methods and intentions were complicated, these records provide glimpses of how European and indigenous worlds intersected in the early 17th century. As the decades progressed, New France expanded. Settlements grew along the St. Lawrence, with trading posts reaching farther into the interior. Farmers cleared land for fields, constructing villages and forts that provided safety and structure. The slow rhythm of life, planting, hunting, trading, and celebrating seasonal festivals, began to form a distinct pattern. Over time, this region would evolve into a complex society, blending European structures with indigenous knowledge and practices. Throughout these years, the land itself remained ever-present. The forests stretched endlessly, rivers glistened in sunlight, and wildlife continued its quiet existence. Caribou migrated across tundra, beavers dammed streams, and birds nested in the high trees. The northern lights still danced across the sky, and the wind whispered through the valleys. Settlers learned to live in harmony with these rhythms, often relying on the same principles that indigenous nations had followed for millennia. Champlain's vision of a permanent colony was more than a matter of trade or politics. It was about understanding a new world and building a sustainable presence within it. His careful approach to alliances, his respect for indigenous knowledge, and his commitment to documenting the land and its peoples ensured that New France endured through early trials. By the mid-17th century, the foundations of a lasting European settlement had been laid, setting the stage for centuries of growth, change, and cultural exchange. As you imagine this period, picture the quiet St. Lawrence River at dawn. Mist rises from the water, curling among the trees, while canoes glide silently along its surface. Settlers prepare for the day, tending gardens or mending tools. Hunters move through the forests, learning from indigenous guides. The air is filled with the scent of wood smoke, pine, and the fresh river breeze. Life is difficult but full of discovery, and each day shapes the foundation of what will become a vibrant, enduring society. In this gentle, patient unfolding of history, we can sense the heartbeat of a land meeting the ambition of explorers and settlers. The story of Quebec, the St. Lawrence, and New France is not only a tale of human endeavor but a reflection of resilience, adaptation, and the deep interconnection between people and the land. As night falls and the stars appear above the river valley, the quiet rhythm of life continues. The past breathes softly, and the story of Canada moves steadily forward, carrying with it the voices of those who lived, loved, and worked along the St. Lawrence, shaping the land and the future of a nation. The St. Lawrence River continued to flow, steady and patient, as settlers and indigenous nations alike navigated the unfolding changes of the 17th century. New France, still young and fragile, began to extend its reach beyond the cliffs of Quebec and the banks of the river. The lure of furs, particularly beaver pelts coveted in Europe for hats and clothing, drove explorers, traders, and settlers further into the interior, setting the stage for both economic growth and complex relations with indigenous nations. Samuel de Champlain and his contemporaries recognized that survival and prosperity in this vast and unfamiliar land depended on cooperation. They formed alliances with nations such as the Huron-Wendat, Algonquin, and Montagnais, who offered knowledge of the forests, lakes, and rivers. Indigenous guides taught Europeans how to navigate the waterways, build effective canoes, and hunt efficiently. In return, the French provided metal tools, cloth, and firearms, items that had quickly become valuable in daily life. The fur trade became a network of mutual dependence, a web of trust, negotiation, and diplomacy that spanned hundreds of miles. Traders, often young men venturing far from the safety of the St. Lawrence Valley, journeyed in birch-bark canoes across lakes and rivers, portaging around rapids and waterfalls, following the migratory paths of beavers and other fur-bearing animals. They established temporary posts along waterways where they exchanged European goods for pelts, sometimes spending weeks or months in the forests, guided by the wisdom of indigenous allies. Each journey was an adventure fraught with risk: storms on lakes, harsh winters, encounters with unfamiliar wildlife, but also with reward, both in wealth and in the accumulation of knowledge about the vast interior. The Huron-Wendat, skilled traders and farmers, became central partners in this expanding economy. Their villages, built near fertile soil and strategic waterways, served as hubs for trade and diplomacy. They cultivated maize, beans, and squash, managed orchards, and harvested the forests for game, fur, and wood. They also maintained intricate social structures, with councils of elders and leaders who guided decisions affecting trade, war, and alliances. European settlers learned to respect these systems, understanding that successful trade depended on honor and negotiation, not force alone. Yet as New France grew, so too did tensions. The Iroquois Confederacy, a powerful alliance of nations to the south, viewed the French and their Huron allies with suspicion and at times hostility. Conflict erupted intermittently, fueled by competition over fur resources and long-standing rivalries between indigenous nations. Champlain himself participated in some of these conflicts, using firearms and tactics unknown to the local peoples, which shifted the balance of power in the region. These clashes, though sporadic, introduced Europeans to the complexities of indigenous politics and the delicate balance required to maintain alliances. Beyond the St. Lawrence, French explorers ventured deeper into the continent. Étienne Brule, a young Frenchman sent by Champlain, lived among the Huron-Wendat and Algonquin peoples, learning their languages, customs, and survival skills. He and others, called coureurs de bois, became essential intermediaries in the fur trade, moving silently through the forests, carrying goods and news, building trust and reputation across vast distances. The forests and rivers were no longer unknown wilderness but pathways of connection, linking distant communities in a network that spanned from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes. The fur trade itself was more than an economic enterprise. It shaped the very patterns of life in New France. Traders timed their journeys to coincide with seasonal cycles. Early spring, when rivers swelled with meltwater, allowed canoes to move swiftly. Summer provided the opportunity to hunt and trap furs, while autumn prepared settlements for the long winter ahead. Trading posts became centers of exchange and culture, where European tools met indigenous craftsmanship, where languages mixed, and where alliances were tested and strengthened. During this period, missionaries also arrived, accompanying traders into the interior. Jesuits, in particular, sought to convert indigenous nations to Christianity, establishing missions and learning local languages to communicate their teachings. Their writings provide a window into these early interactions, though they often reflect European perspectives and misunderstandings. The missionaries were witnesses to both collaboration and conflict, documenting ceremonies, customs, and daily life, sometimes in admiration, sometimes in confusion. Despite the growth of trade and settlement, life in New France remained challenging. Winters were long and bitter, cutting off travel and supplies. Disease, often introduced by Europeans, devastated populations. Yet both settlers and indigenous communities displayed remarkable resilience, relying on knowledge passed through generations and adapting to the demands of the land. Communities celebrated survival with feasts, ceremonies, and shared labor, reinforcing bonds that ensured the continuity of life in the harsh northern climate. As trade networks expanded, so too did cultural exchanges. European tools and weapons became part of indigenous life, while fur and knowledge of the land enriched the economy of France. Marriage alliances between settlers and indigenous partners occasionally occurred, creating families that bridged worlds. Stories, songs, and traditions were shared along rivers and forests, blending languages and customs in subtle ways. The land itself shaped this exchange, offering resources, pathways, and challenges that required cooperation and understanding. The period also saw the first glimpses of permanent settlements beyond the St. Lawrence Valley. Trading posts and small forts appeared in areas that would later become Ontario, Manitoba, and the Great Lakes region. Each outpost was a foothold, a place where the French could anchor their presence while maintaining trade with indigenous nations. The landscape remained dominant and untamed, forests stretching endlessly, rivers carving their way through hills, and wildlife abundant and free. Settlers and traders learned to respect its rhythms, moving in harmony with seasonal changes, the migration of animals, and the cycles of river and forest. Through all these developments, the central importance of indigenous nations remained clear. The Huron-Wendat, Algonquin, Montagnais, and others were not merely guides or trading partners. They were essential architects of this emerging world. Their knowledge, diplomacy, and cooperation enabled the French to survive and thrive in an environment that would have overwhelmed anyone who tried to impose European ways alone. The history of New France in the 17th century is inseparable from these alliances, from the shared labor and mutual respect that underpinned the fur trade and early settlement. By the mid-17th century, New France had transformed from a fragile foothold on the St. Lawrence into a network of trade routes, posts, and settlements reaching deep into the continent. The fur trade had woven together indigenous nations and French settlers in a delicate fabric of economic and social exchange. Conflicts persisted, rivers and forests were explored, and the rhythms of life, planting, hunting, trading, celebrating, continued across the seasons. The land itself, timeless and patient, bore witness to the unfolding story, shaping and sustaining the people who called it home. As you imagine this world, picture a canoe gliding silently through a mist-covered river at dawn, paddles dipping into the still water. Hear the distant call of birds and the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. Traders speak softly in a mixture of French and indigenous languages, carrying furs and tools. Smoke rises from a distant village, curling into the sky. The northern lights shimmer faintly in the distance, a reminder that the land and sky continue their quiet rhythms, indifferent to human ambition yet intimately connected to human survival. This chapter of history, full of movement, trade, and the first real tests of coexistence, sets the stage for the next era of New France. The settlements will grow, alliances will deepen, and the influence of both European and indigenous cultures will expand across the land. Rivers, forests, and lakes remain central to life, guiding trade, communication, and travel. The story of Canada, gentle and patient, continues to unfold, carried along by the rhythm of the land and the people who live in harmony with it. The St. Lawrence River, broad and unhurried, carried the quiet pulse of a growing colony deeper into the northern continent. Life along its banks was a careful balance between survival and ambition, between the rhythms of the land and the demands of a distant king in France. By the mid-17th century, New France had grown beyond the fragile foothold of Quebec, and the search for new settlements, trade routes, and alliances pressed explorers, settlers, and traders further into the interior. One of the most significant developments of this era was the founding of Montreal. In 1642, a group of settlers, guided by the vision of Paul Chomedy de Maisonneuve and the spiritual support of Jean Mance, established Ville Marie on an island in the St. Lawrence River. The location, where the river narrowed and the currents met, offered strategic advantages for trade, defense, and communication. It was also sacred land for the Kanien'kehá:ka, the Mohawk people of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, who had long inhabited the region. Early settlers understood that alliances with indigenous nations were essential, not merely for survival but for the prosperity and security of the new colony. Montreal began as a small cluster of wooden houses, a chapel, and fortifications. The settlers endured harsh winters, with snow piling high and the cold biting through even the thickest clothing. Yet through careful planning and assistance from indigenous allies, the colony survived. Trade became the lifeblood of Ville Marie, as furs from the interior flowed down the rivers, exchanged for European goods, tools, and weapons. Canoes glided silently over calm waters, carrying bundles of beaver pelts, a product that had become essential not only for fashion in Europe but also for the economic stability of New France. The fur trade required not only commerce but careful diplomacy. Indigenous nations controlled the lands and waterways where beaver, fox, and marten thrived. French traders relied on these nations' guidance, learning the geography, seasonal cycles, and hunting practices necessary to sustain long-term trade. The Huron-Wendat, Algonquin, and other allies became vital partners, and traders often spent months living among them, learning their languages, sharing meals, and observing their customs. These interactions shaped the colony's survival strategies and forged relationships that would endure for generations. But with prosperity came tension. The Iroquois Confederacy, situated to the south and west of the St. Lawrence Valley, had become increasingly wary of French alliances with rival nations. Raids on settlements, conflicts over fur trade routes, and sporadic skirmishes marked the years, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty. Champlain had faced such conflicts decades earlier, and now his successors were forced to navigate the delicate balance between defense, diplomacy, and expansion. Forts were constructed not only to protect settlers but to maintain the fragile network of trade and alliances essential to the colony's existence. Life in Montreal, though challenging, was also filled with quiet beauty and rhythm. Summers brought long days, when rivers shimmered in sunlight and forests teemed with life. Settlers planted gardens, raised livestock, and gathered timber for building. Indigenous partners moved gracefully through the forests and waterways, guiding hunters, trapping beavers, and teaching the newcomers the skills required to thrive in a land shaped by ice, water, and seasons. Autumns were a time of harvest, preparation, and community. Villages came alive with feasts, ceremonies, and the exchange of stories and knowledge. Winter demanded resilience as snow covered the land and rivers froze, but it also brought moments of quiet reflection beside fires, listening to the wind and the soft creak of the frozen river. The fur trade pushed French explorers and traders ever deeper into the interior. Men like Radisson, Groseilliers, and other voyagers traveled hundreds of miles into forests and along rivers that Europeans had never charted. They portaged around waterfalls, navigated treacherous rapids, and relied entirely on indigenous knowledge to guide them. Trade routes extended into the Great Lakes region, reaching as far as Lake Superior, Lake Huron, and Lake Ontario. These journeys were long, dangerous, and often lonely, but they connected distant communities and established networks of commerce that would endure for decades. Along these routes, European and indigenous cultures interacted in subtle and profound ways. Trade was not simply an exchange of goods, it was an exchange of knowledge, language, and survival techniques. Settlers learned to hunt and fish using indigenous methods, to travel silently through forests, and to read the signs of the seasons. Indigenous partners incorporated European tools, firearms, and metal goods into their daily life, enhancing their ability to thrive in a rapidly changing world. Canoes, snowshoes, and birch bark shelters became shared technologies, blending traditions in practical and enduring ways. Religious life also shaped the colony. Missionaries, particularly Jesuits, established missions along trade routes and near settlements. They learned indigenous languages and customs, recording in detail the ceremonies, beliefs, and daily life of the peoples they encountered. Their writings, sometimes filled with misunderstanding and bias, nonetheless provide a vivid window into early interactions between Europeans and indigenous nations. These spiritual exchanges, along with trade and diplomacy, created a complex web of relationships that defined life in New France. The natural world remained ever-present, guiding both indigenous and European inhabitants. Rivers, lakes, and forests dictated the timing of travel, the location of settlements, and the movement of animals. Caribou migrated across tundra and forest, beaver dams shaped waterways, and the northern lights shimmered across the sky, silent witnesses to human ambition. Settlers learned to respect these rhythms, adapting European practices to survive and flourish in harmony with the land. Montreal became more than a trading post. It was a center of cultural and economic exchange. Stories, songs, and knowledge flowed along rivers and forests, blending languages and traditions in subtle ways. Families grew, villages expanded, and the colony began to establish a distinct identity rooted in cooperation, resilience, and adaptation. Each success, whether a safe winter, a bountiful harvest, or a fruitful trade expedition, reinforced the foundations of New France and prepared the colony for the challenges and opportunities ahead. By the late 17th century, New France was firmly rooted along the St. Lawrence and into the Great Lakes. The fur trade remained its lifeblood, indigenous alliances its foundation, and rivers its arteries. Life was a delicate balance of survival, negotiation, and adaptation. Conflicts persisted, trade networks expanded, and settlers gradually learned the land's language, the quiet, patient rhythm of forests, rivers, and seasons that had guided its first inhabitants for millennia. As you imagine this world, picture a quiet dawn on the St. Lawrence. Mist rises from the water, curling around the canoes of traders and hunters. Settlers tend gardens and livestock, smoke rising from chimneys into the crisp morning air. Indigenous partners move through the forests with practiced ease, guiding travelers and observing the land. The river flows steadily, reflecting the sky, carrying the pulse of a colony and the whispers of a land that has seen thousands of seasons. The story of Montreal, the fur trade, and the pulse of New France is one of patience, resilience, and collaboration. It is the story of humans learning to thrive in a vast, challenging land, guided by the wisdom of those who have lived there for generations and the ambition of newcomers seeking a future in unknown waters. As night falls, the river glistens under the moonlight, the forest rustles softly in the wind, and the quiet rhythm of life continues, shaping the unfolding story of Canada. The rivers of New France flowed steadily, carrying canoes laden with furs, tools, and news from the interior back to settlements along the St. Lawrence. Life in the colony was a mixture of rhythm and uncertainty as settlers balanced survival, trade, and diplomacy in a land both beautiful and demanding. By the mid-17th century, New France was no longer a single settlement at Quebec or Montreal. It was a network of posts, forts, and missions, each connected by waterways and the fragile threads of trust with indigenous allies. The arrival of new settlers brought energy and growth. Families, clergy, soldiers, and tradespeople journeyed across the Atlantic, seeking opportunity, religious fulfillment, or a fresh start in a distant land. Women, who were few at first, played a critical role in sustaining communities, tending gardens, raising children, and preserving social cohesion. Settlers learned to adapt European practices to the harsh realities of northern winters, growing crops suited to the soil, building homes resilient against snow and frost, and developing diets enriched by hunting, fishing, and trade. The work was demanding, yet the settlers found ways to celebrate the seasons, to gather for communal meals, and to mark the passage of time with ceremonies, music, and prayer. Missionaries accompanied the settlers, bringing the teachings of Christianity to the New World. Jesuits, Recollects, and Sulpicians established missions along the St. Lawrence and deep into the interior, learning indigenous languages and studying local customs. They wrote detailed accounts of the peoples they encountered, observing ceremonies, agricultural practices, and social structures. Their writings, though often filtered through European perspectives, preserve invaluable insights into the cultural richness of indigenous nations, including the Huron-Wendat, Algonquin, Montagnais, and Iroquois. These missions were not merely spiritual centers. They became hubs of cultural exchange. Europeans shared tools, clothing, and knowledge of metallurgy and agriculture, while indigenous peoples provided guidance on survival, navigation, and understanding the rhythms of the land. Young Europeans learned to hunt and fish using indigenous techniques, to travel efficiently by canoe and snowshoe, and to respect the cycles of animals and rivers. In return, indigenous communities acquired goods and technologies that enhanced daily life, from metal knives to firearms and textiles. Over time, these interactions shaped a unique hybrid culture along the waterways of New France, blending the old and new in subtle, enduring ways. Yet the expansion of New France brought challenges. The Iroquois Confederacy, a powerful alliance of nations south of the St. Lawrence, viewed French expansion with suspicion. The Confederacy, composed of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca nations, had long been dominant in trade networks and territorial control. French alliances with the Huron-Wendat, Algonquin, and Montagnais disrupted established patterns, creating tension and intermittent conflict. Raids on settlements, attacks on traders, and skirmishes along the rivers became an ongoing threat, reminding the settlers that life in New France depended not only on endurance but also on careful diplomacy and strategic defense. Fortifications became essential. Wooden palisades, stone forts, and strategically placed garrisons were constructed to protect settlements and trade routes. Soldiers, often young and far from home, learned to navigate the forests and waterways, sometimes participating in campaigns alongside indigenous allies. Life within a fort was regimented yet fragile. A harsh winter, an outbreak of disease, or a sudden attack could disrupt the delicate balance of survival. Despite the hardships, forts also became centers of community, where settlers gathered to trade, worship, and plan for the future. The fur trade remained the economic engine of New France. Canoes traveled hundreds of miles into the interior, guided by indigenous knowledge of rivers, lakes, and portage routes. Traders exchanged European goods for beaver, marten, fox, and other pelts, which were then transported back to Montreal and Quebec before eventually being shipped to France. The trade shaped not only settlement patterns but also the political and social landscape, as alliances with indigenous nations became essential to securing access to prime trapping grounds. Trust, negotiation, and shared understanding were critical, for without indigenous cooperation, the fur trade could not survive. Alongside trade and defense, settlers cultivated the land. Farms expanded near the St. Lawrence, producing wheat, corn, vegetables, and livestock. Gardens were carefully tended, providing sustenance through the long winters. Seasonal rhythms dictated work and rest. Spring brought planting, summer long days of tending crops and trading, autumn harvests, and preparation for winter, while snow and ice slowed travel and allowed time for reflection, storytelling, and communal celebration. Settlers learned to live in harmony with the land, respecting the cycles of animals, rivers, and forests that had guided indigenous nations for centuries. Despite the challenges, New France developed a distinct character. Communities were small but tight-knit, bound by shared labor, faith, and purpose. Families grew. Children learned the skills necessary to survive in both the settlement and the wilderness, and cultural exchanges with indigenous neighbors enriched daily life. Canoes glided silently along rivers at dawn, birch bark tents and longhouses dotted the landscape, and smoke curled from chimneys into crisp northern skies. The rhythm of life was slow, measured, and in harmony with the seasons, a gentle pulse that connected the land, its peoples, and the settlers' dreams. Yet the shadow of conflict loomed. Iroquois raids disrupted trade, attacked villages, and forced French leaders to plan military campaigns. Champlain's successors continued to negotiate alliances, often using a combination of diplomacy and force to maintain a precarious balance. European firearms and tactics introduced new dimensions to these conflicts, shifting traditional power dynamics and creating tension that would last for decades. The Iroquois threat, though intermittent, reminded settlers that the survival of New France depended on vigilance, adaptability, and the maintenance of strategic relationships. The natural world remained central to life and culture. Rivers, lakes, forests, and wildlife dictated travel, trade, and sustenance. Canoes followed the patterns of the currents, portages marked the edges of lakes, and seasonal changes guided agricultural and hunting practices. The northern lights danced across winter skies, the wind whispered through pine and spruce, and the land endured, patient and constant, as generations of indigenous nations and European settlers navigated its challenges. In this period of growth, tension, and adaptation, New France became a society built on relationships between settlers and indigenous nations, traders and farmers, soldiers and missionaries. Life was difficult but rich, shaped by cooperation, negotiation, and the wisdom of those who had lived on the land for centuries. Each day, each journey, each harvest reinforced the fragile yet enduring foundation of a colony that would continue to expand across rivers, forests, and lakes. As night falls along the St. Lawrence, imagine the quiet of a settlement cloaked in snow, the soft glow of candlelight in windows, the murmur of conversation in multiple languages, the distant call of an owl echoing through the trees. Canoes rest along the riverbank, the paddles of traders at rest until morning. Smoke rises from the chimney of a small house, curling toward stars that have witnessed centuries of history. The pulse of New France beats quietly, a rhythm intertwined with the land, its rivers, and the peoples who have shaped its story. This chapter of history, filled with settlers, missions, trade, and the looming presence of the Iroquois Confederacy, marks a turning point in New France's development. Communities are established, alliances forged, and the rhythms of life in the St. Lawrence Valley take hold. The land continues to guide those who dwell upon it, shaping the story of survival, cooperation, and the unfolding narrative of Canada. The waters of the St. Lawrence River carried the lifeblood of New France ever deeper into the continent. Canoes glided silently through misty mornings, laden with furs, supplies, and travelers navigating both familiar and uncharted waterways. The colony had grown beyond its initial settlements, stretching along the river, into the Great Lakes, and toward the dense forests of the interior. Life in New France was a balance of routine and adventure, of survival and opportunity, and every day depended on the skill, courage, and cooperation of those who traveled these vast waters. Among the most vital figures in this expansion were the voyagers. These men, often young and hardy, were the essential link between distant trading posts, settlements, and indigenous nations. They paddled for hours through rivers and lakes, carried heavy packs across portages, and guided canoes through rapids and waterfalls. They spoke multiple languages, negotiated with indigenous traders, and endured long days in rain, snow, and sun. Their knowledge of the waterways was unmatched, and their work ensured that the fur trade, New France's economic heartbeat, remained strong and connected. The voyagers relied on canoes built for speed and endurance, usually crafted from birch bark, spruce, and cedar. These vessels could carry massive loads yet moved swiftly across the water, gliding silently through the forest's reflections. Along the way, voyagers followed routes that indigenous nations had traveled for centuries, carrying goods from post to post and creating a network of exchange that stretched across lakes, rivers, and valleys. Alongside trade, they carried news, stories, and cultural knowledge, bridging worlds and forging connections across the wilderness. Indigenous nations continued to play a central role in this growing economy. The Huron-Wendat, Algonquin, Ottawa, Ojibwe, and others guided French traders, shared expertise in hunting and trapping, and facilitated negotiations with distant communities. Their knowledge of seasonal cycles, animal behavior, and safe travel routes was essential for survival. They understood the rivers as arteries of life, carrying people, goods, and ideas across vast distances. Their collaboration enabled New France to thrive in areas that would have otherwise been inaccessible. The fur trade shaped not only the economy but also social and political life. Trading posts became centers of cultural exchange, where European goods and indigenous expertise met. Metal knives, axes, cloth, and firearms exchanged hands for pelts, but the trade also involved diplomacy, trust, and etiquette. Settlers learned to respect agreements, to honor indigenous practices, and to navigate complex social networks. Alliances forged through trade often determined the success or failure of a settlement or expedition, highlighting the interdependence of these communities. French exploration also continued. Samuel de Champlain's successors pushed further west, following rivers and lakes that connected New France to the heart of the continent. Explorers journeyed along the Ottawa River, ventured into the Great Lakes, and mapped lands that had been home to indigenous nations for generations. These journeys were both practical and symbolic, extending the presence of New France while documenting the geography, resources, and cultures encountered along the way. Maps from this period reveal the contours of lakes, the courses of rivers, and the locations of settlements, providing an enduring record of exploration and discovery. As Europeans ventured farther, they encountered a diversity of nations with complex societies and rich traditions. The Anishinaabe, Cree, and Dakota navigated vast forests and lakes, while the Mississauga and Ojibwe managed trade networks that stretched across the region. These nations were not passive participants in European expansion. They actively engaged in negotiations, formed alliances, and used their knowledge of the land to protect their interests. Conflicts and collaborations shaped the patterns of settlement, trade, and movement, demonstrating the agency and sophistication of indigenous societies. The rivers and lakes themselves dictated much of life. Seasonal cycles determined when canoes could travel, when rivers swelled with spring melt, and when ice made travel impossible. Wildlife, from beaver to moose to migratory birds, followed predictable patterns that guided hunting and trapping. Settlers and traders learned to observe these rhythms, adapting European practices to the environmental realities of the continent. The land remained the ultimate authority, shaping human behavior and sustaining communities through its resources and patterns. Religious life continued to influence the colony. Jesuits, Recollects, and Sulpicians traveled alongside traders and settlers, establishing missions deep in the interior. They learned indigenous languages, recorded customs, and attempted to spread Christianity. While their efforts were met with varying degrees of success, their writings preserve rich details about daily life, ceremonies, and social structures. Missionaries often lived among indigenous nations for months or years, observing closely and recording the interplay between European and indigenous ways of life. The 17th century also saw the intensification of conflict with the Iroquois Confederacy. As French influence expanded into the interior, the Confederacy sought to protect its territory and control over trade routes. Raids on French settlements, attacks on trading parties, and strategic battles became common. French military efforts were often combined with indigenous allies, who provided knowledge, tactics, and manpower. These conflicts, though intermittent, shaped settlement patterns, fortifications, and the development of alliances that would last for generations. Despite conflict, life along the waterways retained its quiet rhythm. Summers brought long, luminous days with canoes drifting across lakes and rivers, fishermen casting nets, and settlers tending crops. Autumns were marked by harvests, preparation for winter, and celebrations of survival. Winters, though harsh, offered moments of reflection by firesides, storytelling, and the soft crackle of wood against the cold. Spring returned with renewal as rivers swelled, animals migrated, and the land awakened once more. These cycles dictated the pace of life and shaped the culture, resilience, and knowledge of all who lived in New France. Cultural exchange continued to weave a unique fabric across the colony. Language, customs, and practices blended, creating hybrid communities where European and indigenous knowledge coexisted. Trade, intermarriage, and shared survival strategies fostered understanding and adaptation. European settlers relied on indigenous guidance for hunting, navigation, and agriculture, while indigenous peoples incorporated European tools, weapons, and ideas into daily life. Together, they navigated the challenges of a continent vast, wild, and demanding, yet rich in resources and opportunity. The voyagers themselves became a symbol of this blending. They moved fluidly between cultures, carrying goods and knowledge across vast distances. Their stories, songs, and experiences were shared in trading posts and settlements, preserving a record of the challenges and triumphs of life in New France. Their skill, endurance, and courage were essential to the survival and growth of the colony, linking rivers and lakes, settlements and forests, people and culture. As night falls over the rivers and forests, imagine a canoe gliding silently beneath a sky lit by stars. Mist curls along the water's surface, and the distant call of wildlife echoes across the lakes. Traders rest along the shore, fires glowing softly, smoke drifting upward. Indigenous guides share stories of the land, and European settlers listen, learning to read the rhythms and signs of the wilderness. The pulse of New France flows quietly through waterways, forests, and settlements, carrying with it the stories, struggles, and triumphs of a land still young and full of promise. This chapter of history, focused on voyagers, rivers, trade, and alliances, shows the heart of New France as it extended into the interior. Life was a delicate balance of survival, negotiation, and exploration, shaped by rivers, forests, and the enduring wisdom of indigenous nations. As the colony expanded, these patterns of cooperation, adaptation, and resilience would continue to guide the growth of New France, shaping the story of Canada in the centuries to come. The rivers of New France continued to flow silently through forests, valleys, and lakes, carrying canoes filled with furs, traders, and explorers. By the late 17th century, the colony had expanded well beyond the original settlements of Quebec and Montreal, yet life along these waterways remained both fragile and vibrant. Indigenous nations, settlers, and voyagers shared a landscape that was as challenging as it was generous, each season dictating movement, trade, and survival. Yet with growth came tension, and the presence of New France in the heart of the continent drew the watchful eyes of powerful neighbors, the Iroquois Confederacy. The Iroquois, composed of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca nations, had long dominated trade routes and territorial control in the northeastern part of the continent. Their confederacy was highly organized, a sophisticated political and military alliance designed to maintain balance among its members and assert power over rivals. The French expansion along the St. Lawrence River and into the interior, often allied with the Huron-Wendat and Algonquin, challenged the Iroquois dominance. Skirmishes, raids, and strategic campaigns became frequent, testing the resilience and diplomacy of New France. The Iroquois Wars, also called the Beaver Wars, were not simply conflicts over territory but battles for control of the lucrative fur trade. Both European settlers and indigenous nations recognized the economic stakes involved. Fur-bearing animals were the lifeblood of the colony, and controlling access to hunting grounds could determine prosperity or hardship. Alliances shifted carefully, sometimes unexpectedly, as nations chose sides based on mutual benefit, protection, and survival. French leaders understood that without indigenous allies, their settlements could be vulnerable, and thus diplomacy, gifts, and military coordination became central strategies. Settlers and soldiers adapted to the challenges of conflict. Forts were strengthened, villages fortified, and patrols extended along rivers and trade routes. Soldiers learned to move quietly through forests, to use terrain to their advantage, and to rely on indigenous knowledge of hunting, scouting, and tracking. Indigenous allies often participated directly in campaigns, providing guidance, intelligence, and manpower. Each skirmish, ambush, or siege was a reminder of the precariousness of life in New France and the importance of strategy, caution, and respect for the land. While conflict shaped the political landscape, the fur trade continued to flourish. Traders and voyagers traveled long distances along rivers and lakes, following seasonal patterns and indigenous guidance. Canoes, laden with beaver, marten, fox, and other pelts, moved silently through forests and along waterways, carrying wealth, supplies, and news. Trading posts became hubs not only for commerce but for cultural exchange, where Europeans and indigenous nations shared stories, food, and skills. The trade networks created a delicate web connecting distant settlements, linking Quebec and Montreal to posts along the Great Lakes, and reaching ultimately into the Mississippi Valley. The French also established missions further into the interior. Jesuit priests and other missionaries traveled alongside traders and settlers, often living among indigenous nations for months or years. They learned languages, recorded customs, and attempted to spread Christianity, blending spiritual guidance with practical support for the community. Their writings provide detailed records of daily life, ceremonies, and interactions, capturing both the beauty and complexity of these exchanges. While their perspective was European, their observations reveal the depth of indigenous culture, diplomacy, and knowledge of the land. As settlements expanded, agriculture became increasingly important. Farms near the St. Lawrence and in the interior produced wheat, maize, vegetables, and livestock. Settlers adapted European techniques to northern climates, learning from indigenous practices and adjusting planting schedules to the rhythms of frost and thaw. Gardens, orchards, and fields sustained families through long winters, and communal labor reinforced social bonds. Life followed a seasonal rhythm: spring planting, summer tending and trading, autumn harvests, and winter reflection by firesides, with storytelling, prayers, and communal gatherings marking the passage of time. The Iroquois threat, though intermittent, shaped not only defense but settlement patterns. Villages clustered near rivers, forts, and trading posts to maximize safety and access to resources. Trade routes were planned with caution, avoiding areas prone to raids or ambush. Diplomacy was constant, with gifts, treaties, and negotiations maintaining tenuous peace when possible. Both Europeans and indigenous nations understood that survival required flexibility, observation, and respect for both natural and political landscapes. Despite conflict, life retained moments of quiet beauty. Canoes drifted across lakes at dawn, the water reflecting the rising sun. Wildlife moved through forests, following seasonal migrations. Settlers tended gardens, repaired homes, and shared meals with neighbors. Indigenous peoples guided travelers, taught survival skills, and maintained traditions that had endured for generations. Together, they created a rhythm of life that balanced work, cooperation, and cultural exchange. The fur trade's expansion into the Mississippi Valley marked another significant chapter. French explorers, guided by indigenous knowledge, navigated rivers and lakes far from the St. Lawrence. Posts were established, trade routes mapped, and alliances extended with nations in present-day Illinois, Wisconsin, and Louisiana. This interior expansion linked New France to a vast continent, creating a network of commerce and culture that stretched across forests, rivers, and plains. Canoes carried furs, tools, and information across hundreds of miles, connecting settlements, trading posts, and indigenous nations in an intricate web of interdependence. Cultural exchange deepened along these routes. Europeans adopted indigenous techniques for hunting, navigation, and winter survival. Indigenous peoples incorporated European tools, firearms, and textiles into daily life. Languages mixed along trade routes, songs and stories were shared around fires, and hybrid communities emerged that blended customs and knowledge from both worlds. The rhythms of the land, migration patterns, river currents, and seasonal changes remained central, guiding movement, trade, and settlement in ways that no map or treaty could fully capture. The natural world remained a constant, shaping life and survival. Rivers carved pathways through forests, lakes reflected the changing skies, and animals moved in predictable cycles. The northern lights shimmered across winter nights, and the whisper of wind through trees carried stories and signals. Settlers, traders, and indigenous nations alike learned to read these rhythms, relying on observation, skill, and respect to navigate a continent both challenging and generous. Through all this, New France endured and grew. Settlements became more permanent, trade networks more intricate, and alliances with indigenous nations more vital. Life remained demanding, yet settlers, voyagers, and indigenous allies found ways to adapt, survive, and thrive. The Iroquois Wars tested resilience, diplomacy, and military skill, while the fur trade and interior exploration offered opportunity, wealth, and connection. Each river, lake, and forest became a path, a resource, and a stage on which the complex story of New France unfolded. As night falls over rivers, forests, and lakes, imagine a canoe gliding silently beneath a sky sprinkled with stars. Mist curls above the water, smoke rises from distant fires, and the quiet sounds of life, animals, water, wind, fill the air. Traders and travelers rest along the shore, sharing stories of the day's journey. Indigenous guides speak softly, teaching the rhythms of the land. The pulse of New France moves quietly through these waters, a rhythm of survival, cooperation, and connection that links past, present, and the unfolding story of a continent still young, wild, and full of promise. This chapter, focused on the Iroquois Wars, fur trade expansion, and interior exploration, highlights both conflict and cooperation as central themes in New France. Settlements and trade networks expanded, indigenous alliances strengthened, and the colony adapted to the rhythms of the land, rivers, and seasons. Through diplomacy, trade, and resilience, New France continued its journey, laying the foundations for centuries of history that would shape the emerging identity of Canada. The waters of New France continued to flow, carrying canoes full of furs, supplies, and travelers along the broad, silent arteries of rivers and lakes. By the late 17th century, the colony had grown into a network of settlements, forts, and trading posts stretching from Quebec and Montreal into the Great Lakes and the interior. Life remained a careful balance between survival, exploration, and diplomacy, guided by the rhythms of the land, the seasons, and the complex web of alliances that linked French settlers with indigenous nations. One of the most important aspects of this era was consolidation. Settlements that had been small and precarious began to stabilize, with stronger fortifications, established farms, and structured communities. Wooden houses gave way to more permanent buildings, and roads and paths connected settlements along rivers and lakes. Montreal and Quebec became central hubs, not only for trade but for governance, culture, and religious life. The French crown, through appointed governors and officials, oversaw these developments, ensuring that the colony remained organized and that its resources were directed toward both survival and expansion. Military forts were essential in this consolidation. Forts like Fort Frontenac on the shores of Lake Ontario and Fort Niagara at the mouth of the Niagara River provided protection for settlers, traders, and allies. They were centers of defense against the Iroquois Confederacy, which continued to contest French expansion and alliances with rival indigenous nations. Soldiers stationed at these forts learned to navigate forests, scout rivers, and work alongside indigenous allies, who contributed both guidance and manpower. The forts also became centers of administration, trade, and communication, linking distant posts and settlements into a cohesive network. The fur trade, central to the colony's economy, thrived along these fortified routes. Traders and voyagers navigated rivers and lakes, carrying beaver, marten, fox, and other furs back to Montreal and Quebec, where they were shipped to Europe. The trade required careful planning, timing, and negotiation. Seasonal cycles dictated when rivers were navigable and when animals were most plentiful. Indigenous nations provided critical knowledge of the land and hunting practices, while Europeans contributed tools, weapons, and goods that had become essential in daily life. Together, they maintained a delicate balance of trust, commerce, and cooperation. Religious missions continued to expand into the interior. Jesuits, Recollects, and Sulpicians traveled alongside traders and settlers, establishing missions near indigenous villages and along trade routes. They learned local languages, recorded customs, and sought to share Christian teachings, often blending spiritual instruction with practical guidance on farming, health, and social organization. Missionaries' writings from this period provide rich accounts of indigenous life, European settlement, and the complex relationships that sustained New France. These missions, though sometimes sources of tension, also became centers of cultural exchange and education, linking the spiritual and practical aspects of life in the colony. The Great Lakes region became increasingly central to the colony's expansion. Traders and explorers pushed westward from Montreal and Quebec, following rivers and portages into the heart of the continent. Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, and Lake Superior became thoroughfares for commerce, exploration, and communication. Trading posts and small settlements dotted the shores, serving as hubs for the exchange of goods, knowledge, and diplomacy. Canoes glided silently across the lakes, carrying furs, tools, and news from one community to another, connecting distant lands in a vast network of human activity. Indigenous alliances remained the foundation of this expansion. Nations such as the Huron-Wendat, Algonquin, Anishinaabe, and Ottawa provided guidance, facilitated trade, and negotiated political relationships. Their knowledge of the land, rivers, lakes, forests, and animal migrations was indispensable for European survival and prosperity. In turn, European settlers and traders introduced new technologies, goods, and ideas, creating hybrid communities where knowledge and culture flowed in both directions. These alliances were delicate, requiring diplomacy, respect, and careful attention to local politics and traditions. Conflict, however, persisted. The Iroquois Confederacy remained a formidable presence, conducting raids on settlements, attacking trading parties, and challenging French alliances. The French response combined military strategy with diplomacy, seeking both to protect their settlements and to maintain access to vital trade routes. Indigenous allies participated actively in these conflicts, guiding campaigns, providing intelligence, and engaging in strategic combat. Each skirmish, each negotiation, reinforced the necessity of trust, observation, and adaptability in a land that was both generous and demanding. Agriculture and daily life also stabilized during this period. Settlers cultivated fields of wheat, corn, vegetables, and orchards, learning to adapt European methods to northern climates. Livestock became an essential part of sustaining communities through harsh winters. Gardens, communal labor, and shared resources strengthened social cohesion, while seasonal rhythms guided planting, harvesting, hunting, and fishing. Life moved in harmony with the land cycles. As rivers rose and fell, animals migrated, and forests and fields provided both sustenance and guidance. Cultural exchange continued to shape New France's identity. Trade, intermarriage, and shared survival strategies created communities where European and indigenous knowledge coexisted. Languages blended along trade routes, songs and stories were shared by campfires and in villages, and practical skills, canoe building, hunting, navigation, farming, passed between cultures. The land itself remained the ultimate authority, shaping behavior, guiding movement, and sustaining life through its resources, rhythms, and cycles. The colony also witnessed the emergence of a more structured governance system. Governors, military officials, and religious leaders coordinated defense, trade, and settlement planning. Laws and regulations, while still evolving, provided a framework for dispute resolution, trade practices, and relations with indigenous nations. Montreal and Quebec served as centers for administration, linking the interior posts and settlements through rivers and communication networks. This structure allowed New France to survive challenges, expand its influence, and maintain connections across vast distances. The forests, rivers, and lakes were silent witnesses to these developments. Wildlife continued its seasonal migrations, trees grew tall and dense, and rivers reflected the changing skies. Canoes drifted along the currents, laden with goods and stories. Settlers worked the land, tending crops, raising livestock, and building homes. Indigenous nations maintained hunting grounds, villages, and trade networks. Together, these rhythms created a living mosaic of human endeavor and natural order, shaped by cooperation, resilience, and adaptation. As night falls across the Great Lakes, imagine the quiet of a settlement nestled along a riverbank. Fires glow softly, smoke rising into the cool air. Canoes rest at the water's edge, and distant voices, French, Huron, Algonquin, carry across the still night. Wolves howl faintly in the distance, and the wind whispers through pine and spruce. The stars reflect on calm lakes, and the pulse of New France beats steadily, guided by rivers, forests, and the enduring knowledge of those who navigate its waters. This chapter, focused on consolidation, missions, and the Great Lakes expansion, illustrates how New France matured from a fragile set of settlements into a structured, interconnected colony. Forts provided security, missions nurtured spiritual and cultural life, trade networks expanded, and indigenous alliances remained central to survival and prosperity. The rhythms of the land, its rivers, forests, and lakes, shaped life and history, guiding the colony through challenges, growth, and the steady unfolding of its story. The rivers of New France flowed like veins through the continent, connecting distant settlements, trading posts, and indigenous nations. Canoes glided silently over lakes and along rivers, laden with beaver pelts, supplies, and news, carrying the lifeblood of the colony deeper into the interior. By the late 17th century, New France had matured into a complex network of communities, forts, and trade routes, stretching from Quebec and Montreal into the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi Valley. Life was a careful balance between exploration, diplomacy, trade, and survival, shaped by the land, the seasons, and the intricate web of alliances that linked French settlers and indigenous peoples. The fur trade had reached its peak, becoming both the economic engine and social glue of the colony. Beaver pelts were highly prized in Europe for their use in hats and clothing, creating immense demand that fueled exploration, trade, and settlement. Canoes, carrying furs from distant lakes and rivers, became symbols of connection and endurance. Traders, voyagers, and indigenous guides worked together to ensure the flow of goods, navigating rivers, portaging across forests, and braving storms, rapids, and long winters. The trade was not merely an exchange of goods, but an intricate system of trust, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that bound communities together across hundreds of miles. Expansion into the Mississippi Valley marked a new chapter for New France. Explorers like René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, ventured down the Mississippi River, establishing posts and claiming lands for France. Forts such as Fort St. Louis and trading posts in the Illinois country became crucial hubs, linking the interior with the St. Lawrence River settlements. The Mississippi, vast and winding, was both a route for commerce and a corridor for influence, allowing New France to extend its presence deep into North America. Canoes navigated its tributaries, carrying furs, supplies, and the knowledge of lands that few Europeans had ever seen. Indigenous nations remained central to this expansion. The Illinois, Miami, Shawnee, and other nations provided guidance, shared knowledge of rivers and hunting grounds, and facilitated trade. Alliances were carefully negotiated, maintained through gifts, diplomacy, and shared interests. European settlers depended on indigenous knowledge of seasonal cycles, animal migrations, and safe travel routes. In return, indigenous nations benefited from European tools, firearms, cloth, and other goods that enhanced daily life and trade capabilities. The interdependence of these communities underscored the complexity and delicacy of expansion into new territories. Life in settlements along the Mississippi and Great Lakes required adaptation. Agriculture provided sustenance, with settlers planting wheat, corn, vegetables, and orchards adapted to northern climates. Livestock supplied meat, milk, and labor. Daily routines were dictated by the seasons: spring planting, summer tending, autumn harvests, and winter preparation. Settlers learned to navigate rivers, forests, and lakes with skill and caution, guided by indigenous knowledge and their own growing experience. Even amidst the challenges of harsh winters and long journeys, life retained moments of quiet beauty: the gentle ripple of a canoe on still water, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the soft glow of fires in settlements and camps. The Jesuits and other missionaries continued their work, extending missions deeper into the interior. They learned languages, recorded customs, and sought to share Christian teachings, often blending spiritual guidance with practical support. Their journals preserve detailed accounts of daily life, ceremonies, and the intricate relationships between Europeans and indigenous peoples. Missionaries documented the challenges of travel, the customs of nations they encountered, and the delicate balance of influence, guidance, and respect that shaped colonial life. Conflict, however, remained an ever-present reality. The Iroquois Confederacy continued to assert influence in regions contested by French expansion. Intermittent raids, skirmishes, and military campaigns shaped settlement patterns and trade routes. French forces, often allied with indigenous nations, relied on scouts, strategic planning, and knowledge of terrain to protect villages and trading posts. Diplomacy, gifts, and negotiation were as critical as firearms and fortifications, as alliances determined access to trade and the safety of settlers. Life in New France was a constant interplay of trust, vigilance, and adaptability, a rhythm dictated by both human ambition and the land itself. The natural world shaped every aspect of life. Rivers and lakes guided travel, while forests provided wood, shelter, and game. Animals followed seasonal cycles, influencing hunting and trapping patterns. The Mississippi, with its tributaries and surrounding forests, offered both opportunity and challenge, a vast corridor linking New France with lands far beyond its original settlements. Canoes moved silently along these waters, carrying furs, supplies, and news, connecting communities and sustaining the economic and cultural life of the colony. Cultural exchange deepened in this era. European settlers learned skills from indigenous nations: tracking, hunting, canoe navigation, and understanding the rhythms of the land. Indigenous peoples incorporated European tools, weapons, and textiles into daily life. Trade, intermarriage, and shared labor created hybrid communities where knowledge, language, and customs flowed in both directions. The land, rivers, and forests remained the ultimate authority, shaping survival, guiding movement, and preserving the balance between human ambition and environmental reality. The fur trade's success also reinforced the strategic importance of forts and settlements. Forts like Fort Frontenac, Fort Niagara, and posts along the Mississippi provided security for traders, served as bases for military campaigns, and became centers of administration. Soldiers, settlers, and indigenous allies collaborated to maintain these structures, ensuring the flow of trade and the stability of the colony. Life within a fort combined discipline with community, offering protection and continuity in a land that could be both generous and unforgiving. As European influence expanded along the Mississippi, settlements grew more interconnected. News, supplies, and ideas traveled along rivers and lakes, linking Montreal, Quebec, and interior posts. Traders and voyagers became the lifeline of this network, carrying both commerce and culture. Canoes transported furs, tools, letters, and news, while rivers and portages guided the movement of people and ideas across hundreds of miles of wilderness. These waterways, alive with the pulse of New France, reflected the interdependence of communities and the constant negotiation between survival, trade, and exploration. Life in New France continued to follow seasonal rhythms. Summers brought long days, bright skies, and abundant wildlife, while settlers tended crops and engaged in trade. Autumns were a time of harvest, preparation, and reflection, while winter brought harsh cold, frozen rivers, and time for storytelling, crafts, and prayer. Spring heralded renewal as ice melted, rivers swelled, and the land awakened. These cycles shaped the colony's culture, guiding labor, travel, and interaction with both the land and its inhabitants. As night falls along the Mississippi and Great Lakes, imagine a canoe drifting silently beneath a sky scattered with stars. Mist rises from calm waters, smoke curls from distant fires, and the quiet rustle of leaves fills the air. Traders rest along riverbanks, sharing stories and listening to indigenous guides who speak softly of the land, its secrets, and its rhythms. The pulse of New France flows quietly through these waterways, reflecting the interconnected lives of settlers, voyagers, and indigenous nations as they navigate trade, conflict, and survival in a vast and challenging continent. This chapter, focused on the peak of the fur trade, expansion along the Mississippi, and growing French influence, illustrates how New France matured into a complex, interconnected colony. Trade, diplomacy, exploration, and adaptation shaped daily life, while alliances with indigenous nations ensured survival and prosperity. Rivers, lakes, and forests guided movement, commerce and culture, providing both opportunity and challenge. The story of New France is one of interdependence, resilience, and the steady unfolding of human ambition within the rhythms of the land. The rivers and lakes of New France continued their quiet, steady flow, carrying canoes filled with furs, supplies, and travelers across forests and valleys. By the late 17th century, the colony had become a network of settlements, forts, and trade routes, stretching from Quebec and Montreal into the Great Lakes and Mississippi Valley. Life was both challenging and full of quiet rhythm, guided by the cycles of the seasons, the movements of wildlife, and the intricate relationships between settlers, traders, and indigenous nations. Settlements along the St. Lawrence and Great Lakes had matured into thriving communities. Wooden houses had been replaced by more permanent structures, and roads and trails connected villages, trading posts, and forts. Montreal, Quebec, and other settlements became hubs of administration, culture, and commerce, linking distant posts through rivers and overland routes. Daily life revolved around farming, trade, family, and religion, each day following a steady rhythm dictated by the natural world. Gardens, fields, and livestock sustained communities through harsh winters, while rivers and forests provided both resources and routes for travel. Cultural life grew alongside economic and political development. French settlers brought traditions, language, and religion from Europe, and these elements merged with indigenous customs in subtle and enduring ways. Trade routes became conduits not only for goods but for stories, songs, and knowledge. European settlers learned hunting and fishing techniques, snowshoe travel, and navigation from indigenous partners, while indigenous nations incorporated European tools, clothing, and methods into daily life. Over time, this blending created a unique culture, distinct to New France, shaped by both European and indigenous influence. Religious life continued to play a central role. Jesuits, Recollects, and Sulpicians established missions and churches in settlements and along trade routes, teaching, guiding, and documenting life in the colony. They recorded languages, ceremonies, and social practices, creating a written record of indigenous life, European settlement, and the interactions that shaped the colony. Religious instruction provided structure, education, and spiritual guidance, while missions also served as centers of community, trade, and cultural exchange. The fur trade remained the economic heart of New France. Canoes glided silently along rivers and lakes, carrying pelts, tools, and goods. Traders and voyagers were skilled in navigation, negotiation, and survival, traveling hundreds of miles into the interior, guided by indigenous knowledge of seasonal cycles, safe routes, and animal behavior. Trade posts connected distant communities, enabling a flow of commerce that sustained both settlers and indigenous partners. The fur trade influenced settlement patterns, political alliances, and daily routines, binding the colony together across vast distances. Expansion into the interior brought both opportunity and conflict. Indigenous alliances were essential to secure access to fur-bearing lands, negotiate trade, and ensure safety. Nations such as the Huron-Wendat, Algonquin, Ottawa, and Anishinaabe guided settlers and traders, providing expertise in hunting, navigation, and diplomacy. In return, European goods, firearms, tools, and textiles enriched daily life and strengthened alliances. These relationships were intricate and delicate, requiring careful negotiation and mutual respect, as the success of settlements and trade networks depended on cooperation. Tensions also arose with neighboring English colonies to the south and east. Competition for trade, territory, and alliances sometimes led to skirmishes, raids, and diplomatic challenges. French authorities negotiated with indigenous nations to secure loyalty, trade rights, and defense, while English colonies pursued similar strategies, creating a complex landscape of shifting alliances and intermittent conflict. The boundaries of influence were not clearly defined, and both settlers and indigenous nations navigated these tensions with strategy, patience, and vigilance. Life in settlements continued to follow the rhythm of the seasons. Spring brought planting and preparation for the warmer months. Summer offered long days of labor in fields, gardens, and forests, punctuated by trade expeditions and social gatherings. Autumn was harvest season, a time of preparation for the harsh winter months, with communal labor, feasting, and celebrations marking the end of the growing season. Winter brought quiet reflection, the crackle of fires, storytelling, and skillful navigation across snow-covered landscapes. These seasonal cycles shaped daily life, guided human activity, and created continuity and stability in the colony. Education and social structures began to take shape. Children learned practical skills, including farming, fishing, hunting, and navigation, as well as reading, writing, and religious instruction. Families formed the core of social life, with roles divided according to tradition, labor needs, and cultural norms. Settlements were structured around communal needs, with trade posts, churches, and meeting spaces creating centers of activity and interaction. Life was demanding but structured, and the blending of European and indigenous knowledge strengthened resilience and adaptability. Military preparedness remained essential. Forts provided security against raids and conflicts, particularly with the Iroquois Confederacy, which continued to contest trade routes and territory. Soldiers, settlers, and indigenous allies collaborated to defend villages, maintain strategic positions, and patrol trade routes. Diplomacy, negotiation, and gift-giving complemented military strategy, ensuring that the colony could survive and thrive despite ongoing challenges. Each fort, patrol, and trading post served as a node in a complex network of defense, commerce, and cultural exchange. The natural world remained central to life and culture. Rivers guided travel, forests provided shelter and resources, and wildlife followed predictable seasonal patterns. Settlers and indigenous nations observed and respected these cycles, adapting daily practices to the rhythms of the land. Canoes moved silently along misty rivers at dawn, forests whispered with the sound of wildlife, and lakes reflected the changing skies. The land's constancy contrasted with human conflict, offering both challenge and sustenance, shaping settlement patterns, trade routes, and cultural life. As night falls over the St. Lawrence and Great Lakes, imagine the quiet of a settlement nestled along a riverbank. Smoke rises gently from chimneys, canoes rest at the water's edge, and distant voices, French, Algonquin, Huron, carry softly across the night. The stars reflect on calm waters, while the wind rustles through the forest, and the sounds of nocturnal wildlife provide a gentle accompaniment to the quiet human presence. The pulse of New France continues, steady and resilient, shaped by rivers, forests, trade, diplomacy, and the enduring rhythms of life along these waterways. This chapter, focusing on cultural growth, settlement consolidation, and tensions with English colonies, illustrates how New France matured into a network of interconnected communities. Trade, diplomacy, education, and religion guided daily life, while forts and indigenous alliances ensured security and prosperity. Seasonal rhythms structured work and social life, and the land remained the ultimate authority, shaping human activity and sustaining life. Through resilience, adaptation, and cooperation, New France continued to grow, leaving an enduring legacy in the landscape and story of Canada. The rivers of New France continued their slow, steady passage through forests and lakes, carrying canoes laden with furs, supplies, and travelers. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the colony had matured into a network of settlements, forts, and trade posts stretching from Quebec and Montreal through the Great Lakes and into the Mississippi Valley. Life remained closely tied to the land, shaped by the rhythms of the seasons, the movement of animals, and the intricate relationships between settlers, voyagers, and indigenous nations. Yet under the rule of Louis XIV, New France entered a period of centralization, structured governance, and increasing tension with both indigenous nations and English colonies. Louis XIV sought to strengthen French authority in North America, placing the colony under more direct control from the crown. Governors, intendant officials, and military commanders coordinated settlement expansion, trade regulation, and defense. Montreal and Quebec became central hubs, not only for commerce and administration but also for cultural life, with churches, missions, and schools reinforcing European traditions. This centralization brought more structure to New France, standardizing governance, trade, and military practices, while creating a framework for long-term stability in a vast and often unpredictable land. Military organization became a priority. The Iroquois Confederacy remained a persistent challenge, raiding settlements and contesting French influence. French authorities, often in coordination with indigenous allies, strengthened forts, trained militias, and developed strategic campaigns to protect settlements and trade routes. Soldiers learned to navigate forests, portage canoes, and collaborate with indigenous scouts who provided crucial intelligence on terrain, movement, and seasonal conditions. These fortifications and strategic alliances were essential for ensuring the colony's survival and expanding its influence across the interior. Trade continued to be the lifeblood of New France. The fur trade connected Montreal, Quebec, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi Valley, with traders and voyagers carrying pelts, supplies, and information across vast distances. Canoes glided through misty mornings, carrying beaver, marten, fox, and other valuable pelts to trading posts. Indigenous nations remained indispensable partners, providing expertise in hunting, navigation, and diplomacy. European goods, tools, cloth, firearms, and other items enhanced indigenous daily life and strengthened alliances, while trade routes and posts created an interconnected network sustaining both economic prosperity and social cohesion. Settlements continued to grow and stabilize. Farms, orchards, and gardens supplied food for families, while communal labor reinforced social bonds. The rhythms of life were shaped by the seasons: spring planting, summer cultivation and trade, autumn harvests, and winter reflection. Houses were built to withstand harsh northern winters, while barns, fences, and storage facilities preserved food and supplies. Life was challenging but structured, with settlers learning to adapt European techniques to the realities of North America and integrating indigenous knowledge to survive and thrive. Religious and cultural institutions flourished. Jesuits, Recollects, and Sulpicians expanded missions and schools throughout the colony, teaching, guiding, and recording life in New France. Their efforts preserved languages, ceremonies, and social practices while promoting European cultural and religious traditions. Churches became central to settlement life, offering spiritual guidance, education, and community cohesion. At the same time, indigenous allies and communities maintained their own traditions, creating a cultural mosaic that blended European and indigenous knowledge, practices, and beliefs in ways that shaped the identity of New France. Expansion into the interior continued, with forts and trading posts spreading along the Great Lakes, rivers, and Mississippi tributaries. Canoes carried traders, supplies, and news, connecting distant settlements and linking communities into a cohesive colonial network. Posts such as Fort St. Louis and Fort Frontenac became hubs of commerce, defense, and diplomacy, while indigenous nations guided travelers, negotiated trade, and maintained alliances. The land itself, The forests, rivers, lakes, and wildlife remained the ultimate authority, shaping movement, settlement, and survival across the colony. Tensions with English colonies intensified. Competition over trade, alliances, and territory sometimes erupted into skirmishes or threatened conflict. French authorities negotiated with indigenous nations to secure loyalty and protect trade networks, while English colonies pursued similar strategies to expand influence. The struggle for dominance required careful diplomacy, military preparedness, and strategic alliances, with both European and indigenous participants navigating a landscape of shifting loyalties and contested claims. Cultural and economic life continued to intertwine. Settlers learned skills from indigenous neighbors, including hunting, fishing, and navigating rivers and forests, while indigenous nations incorporated European tools, firearms, and textiles into daily life. Trade routes were conduits for stories, knowledge, and cultural exchange, as well as commerce. Canoes moved silently across lakes at dawn, and forests echoed with the sounds of daily labor, wildlife, and distant voices. The blending of European and indigenous cultures created a distinctive identity for New France, marked by adaptability, resilience, and interconnectedness. Life in settlements followed seasonal rhythms. Spring brought planting and preparation, while summer offered long days of work and trade. Autumn harvests were a time of community labor and celebration, preparing for the challenges of winter. Snow-covered landscapes brought quiet reflection, storytelling, and skill-building indoors. Each season dictated work, travel, and social activity, reinforcing the colony's connection to the land and its cycles. These rhythms became embedded in the daily experience of settlers, shaping culture, labor, and survival. Education and social structures developed further. Children learned both practical and spiritual skills, including farming, hunting, navigation, reading, and religious instruction. Families formed the foundation of settlement life, with roles divided according to labor needs and tradition. Trading posts, forts, and missions provided spaces for social interaction, commerce, and governance. Community life was structured yet flexible, shaped by both the natural world and the colonial administration under Louis XIV. The natural world continued to guide and sustain life. Rivers and lakes dictated travel, forests provided shelter and resources, and wildlife followed seasonal patterns that influenced hunting and trade. Canoes drifted along misty rivers, the reflection of early morning light shimmering on calm waters. Settlers tended fields and gardens, while indigenous nations navigated forests and waterways with expert knowledge. The land's constancy offered both challenge and support, shaping the rhythms of life and sustaining the colony through centuries of growth and change. As night falls across New France, imagine the calm of a settlement along the St. Lawrence or a lake in the interior. Fires glow softly in homes and forts, smoke drifting upward. Canoes rest at the water's edge, and the quiet sounds of the forest and river fill the night. Voices, French, Algonquin, Huron, and others, carry softly in the evening air. The pulse of New France beats steadily, shaped by rivers, forests, trade, diplomacy, and the enduring presence of settlers, voyagers, and indigenous nations navigating survival, growth, and cultural exchange in a vast and beautiful land. This chapter focused on the centralization of New France under Louis XIV, growth of settlements, cultural development, and tensions with English colonies, highlights how governance, trade, and diplomacy shaped the colony. Indigenous alliances, economic networks, military preparedness, and the rhythms of the land were central to life. Through careful administration, adaptation, and resilience, New France continued to grow, creating a lasting legacy in the landscape, culture, and history of what would eventually become Canada. The rivers of New France continued to carve their way through forests, plains, and lakes, carrying canoes laden with furs, supplies, and travelers far into the continent's interior. By the early 18th century, the colony had grown into a network of settlements, trading posts, and forts stretching from Quebec and Montreal through the Great Lakes and into the Mississippi Valley. Life along these waterways was shaped by the cycles of the seasons, the rhythms of the land, and the interwoven relationships between European settlers, indigenous nations, and voyagers who navigated both commerce and diplomacy across vast distances. Expansion along the Mississippi River became a defining feature of New France's early 18th century growth. Explorers and traders navigated the river's tributaries, establishing posts in what is now Illinois, Missouri, and Louisiana. Forts and settlements served as centers of commerce, defense, and governance, linking the interior with Montreal and Quebec. Canoes moved silently along the waters, carrying beaver, marten, fox, and other furs, along with tools, textiles, and other goods that connected communities hundreds of miles apart. These waterways formed the lifelines of the colony, supporting trade, exploration, and cultural exchange. Indigenous nations remained central to the success of these ventures. The Illinois, Miami, Shawnee, and other nations provided expertise in navigation, knowledge of the land, and access to hunting grounds. Alliances were carefully negotiated, maintained through gifts, trade, and diplomacy, ensuring mutual benefit and protection. Settlers depended on these relationships to navigate unfamiliar territories, while indigenous communities gained access to European goods, technologies, and trade networks. These partnerships were intricate and delicate, reflecting both cooperation and the need for constant negotiation. Life in settlements along the Mississippi and Great Lakes combined adaptation, labor, and community. Agriculture provided sustenance, with settlers cultivating wheat, corn, vegetables, and orchards suited to the northern and riverine climates. Livestock supplied meat, milk, and labor for farming. Daily routines followed the rhythms of the seasons: spring planting, summer cultivation and trade, autumn harvest, and winter preparation. Winter brought harsh cold and frozen waterways, yet it also allowed reflection, indoor skill building, and the sharing of stories, songs, and traditions by firesides. Life was demanding yet structured, with settlers learning to adapt European techniques to North American realities while integrating indigenous knowledge. Religious and cultural life continued to flourish. Jesuits, Recollects, and Sulpicians established missions in settlements and along rivers, teaching, guiding, and recording life in New France. Their writings preserved languages, ceremonies, and customs of indigenous nations while maintaining European religious and educational traditions. Churches became centers of community life, offering spiritual guidance, education, and social cohesion. Indigenous communities continued to practice their own beliefs and traditions, creating a cultural tapestry that blended European and indigenous influence in unique and enduring ways. Trade remained the economic heartbeat of New France. Canoes carrying furs, supplies, and messages connected distant posts and settlements. The fur trade required careful planning, negotiation, and trust. Indigenous partners provided knowledge of animal behavior, seasonal migrations, and safe travel routes, while European traders supplied tools, firearms, cloth, and other goods that facilitated daily life. Trading posts served as hubs of commerce, diplomacy, and cultural exchange, linking communities across rivers, lakes, and forests in a network of interdependence that sustained both settlers and indigenous nations. Tensions with English colonies persisted. Competition for territory, trade, and alliances occasionally erupted into skirmishes or threatened larger conflicts. French authorities negotiated with indigenous nations to secure loyalty, protect trade routes, and defend settlements. Diplomatic gifts, ceremonies, and negotiations were as important as military strategy, as alliances determined access to resources, trade, and security. Life in New France required careful attention to politics, negotiation, and the delicate balance of power among European and indigenous participants. Fortifications and military preparedness remained central to survival. Forts along the Great Lakes, Mississippi, and St. Lawrence provided protection for settlers, trade routes, and indigenous allies. Soldiers learned to navigate forests, portage canoes, and work with indigenous scouts to anticipate threats and safeguard the colony. These forts were not only military installations but centers of administration, commerce, and diplomacy, ensuring that New France maintained stability and influence despite ongoing challenges. Cultural exchange shaped the social fabric of the colony. Settlers adopted indigenous skills, including hunting, fishing, canoeing, and knowledge of seasonal patterns. Indigenous nations incorporated European tools, firearms, textiles, and new methods into daily life. Languages blended along trade routes, and stories, songs, and traditions moved between communities. The colony's identity was formed through these interactions, a combination of European heritage and indigenous wisdom that allowed communities to survive and thrive in a demanding landscape. Life in New France remained closely tied to the natural world. Rivers and lakes dictated movement and commerce. Forests provided shelter and resources, and wildlife followed predictable seasonal cycles that guided hunting and trapping. Canoes moved silently over calm waters, reflecting the sky and trees. Settlers tended fields, gardens, and livestock, while indigenous nations navigated forests, rivers, and lakes with expert skill. The land shaped daily life, trade, and cultural practice, providing sustenance, direction, and the rhythms that govern survival. Education, governance, and social structure developed alongside expansion. Children learned both practical and spiritual skills, from farming and hunting to reading, writing, and religious instruction. Families formed the foundation of social life, with labor and responsibility distributed according to custom and necessity. Settlements and forts provided spaces for governance, trade, and social activity, while missions and churches offered education and moral guidance. Community life was both structured and flexible, adapting to the seasons, the land, and the challenges of expansion. As night falls along the Mississippi and Great Lakes, imagine the quiet of a settlement resting beneath a starry sky. Fires glow softly, canoes drift at the water's edge, and the distant sounds of wildlife mingle with the voices of French settlers, voyagers, and indigenous allies. Mist rises from calm waters, forests whisper in the wind, and the pulse of New France flows steadily, shaped by trade, diplomacy, agriculture, and cultural exchange. The colony moves quietly through the night, guided by rivers, forests, and the enduring knowledge and resilience of its people. This chapter, focused on Mississippi expansion, diplomacy with indigenous nations, and early 18th century life, illustrates how New France extended its influence, integrated indigenous knowledge, and navigated complex political and economic realities. Trade, alliances, settlement, and seasonal rhythms shaped daily life, while forts, missions, and governance structures provided security, stability, and cultural cohesion. Through adaptation, cooperation, and resilience, New France continued to grow, weaving a legacy that would endure in the landscapes, rivers, and communities of Canada. The rivers of New France continued their quiet flow through forests, valleys, and lakes, carrying canoes laden with furs, supplies, and travelers deep into the heart of the continent. By the mid-18th century, the colony had reached the height of its territorial expansion, stretching from Quebec and Montreal through the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi Valley. Settlements were more stable than ever, forts were strategically positioned, and trade networks connected distant communities. Yet, as New France matured, the pressure from the British colonies to the south and east increased, setting the stage for conflict that would reshape the landscape and destiny of the colony. The British colonies were growing rapidly, their populations swelling and their economic ambitions expanding. English traders, settlers, and military forces increasingly encroached on territories claimed by New France, seeking control of the lucrative fur trade and access to interior lands. The struggle for dominance was not merely about land but about influence over indigenous nations whose alliances determined trade routes, military strength, and political power. Both French and English authorities recognized that the loyalty of indigenous nations could tip the balance in favor of one power or the other. Diplomacy with indigenous nations became increasingly critical. The French relied on long-standing alliances with nations such as the Huron-Wendat, Algonquin, Ottawa, and Anishinaabe, maintaining relationships through gifts, trade, and mutual defense agreements. Indigenous partners provided guidance, protection, and access to fur-bearing territories, while European goods enhanced daily life and strengthened bonds. Diplomacy required careful observation and negotiation, as shifting alliances and the growing presence of English traders introduced new challenges and complexities into the region. Military preparedness intensified throughout the colony. Forts along the St. Lawrence, Great Lakes, and Mississippi were reinforced and supplied, and militias were trained to protect settlements, trade routes, and strategic posts. Soldiers and indigenous allies collaborated in patrols, reconnaissance, and defensive operations, moving quietly through forests, across rivers, and over portages. Strategic planning and intelligence gathering became vital for survival, as even a small skirmish could have far-reaching consequences for trade, alliances, and the security of settlements. Trade networks remained the backbone of New France's economy, but competition with English traders added tension. Canoes continued to glide silently over rivers and lakes, carrying furs, tools, textiles, and supplies, while traders negotiated the delicate balance of trust, reciprocity, and diplomacy with indigenous partners. Trading posts served not only as centers of commerce but as hubs of social and cultural exchange, where languages, customs, and knowledge flowed freely between communities. These networks were intricate and vulnerable, reflecting both the opportunities and the risks of colonial life. Settlements were increasingly fortified and organized to withstand the mounting pressures. Montreal, Quebec, and other towns became centers of administration, culture, and defense, coordinating communication and logistics across vast distances. Agriculture continued to sustain communities, with fields, gardens, orchards, and livestock providing food through long winters. Daily life followed the rhythm of the seasons, with planting, cultivation, harvesting, and preparation forming a cycle of labor, adaptation, and reflection. The resilience and resourcefulness of settlers were tested by harsh winters, unpredictable weather, and the constant awareness of potential conflict. Cultural and religious life maintained stability amidst uncertainty. Churches, missions, and schools offered spiritual guidance, education, and social cohesion, while indigenous communities preserved their own traditions and knowledge. The blending of European and indigenous practices created a unique cultural landscape, where language, rituals, and daily life intertwined across settlements and trading posts. Music, storytelling, and communal gatherings provided continuity and comfort, reinforcing the bonds that held communities together even in times of tension. The French crown increased its administrative oversight during this period, strengthening governance structures and centralizing authority. Governors, intendants, and military officials coordinated defense, trade regulation, and settlement planning, ensuring that New France remained cohesive and resilient despite external threats. Decisions made in Montreal or Quebec had consequences across the interior, influencing fort placements, trade alliances, and diplomatic negotiations with Indigenous nations. The administration sought to balance economic growth, territorial defense, and political control, navigating a landscape of competing interests and complex relationships. Conflict with the English colonies gradually escalated. Border skirmishes, trade disputes, and competing claims to land created tension along the frontiers. Both sides sought alliances with Indigenous nations, understanding that their support could determine military and economic advantage. Indigenous partners, in turn, navigated these pressures with skill and strategy, aligning with whichever European power best served their interests, while preserving access to trade and hunting grounds. The delicate balance of loyalty, diplomacy, and survival became central to life in New France and the surrounding regions. The natural world remained an enduring guide and challenge. Rivers dictated movement, forests provided shelter and resources, and wildlife followed seasonal patterns that shaped hunting, trapping, and settlement. Canoes drifted across misty waters, reflecting early morning light. Settlers tended crops and livestock, repaired homes, and maintained roads and fortifications, while Indigenous communities traveled the forests and rivers with knowledge accumulated over generations. The land shaped behavior, economy, and culture, offering sustenance and direction, as well as challenges that demanded resilience and skill. Daily life followed familiar rhythms. Spring brought planting and preparation, summer offered long days of work, trade, and social gatherings, autumn provided harvest and reflection, and winter offered quiet, indoor activities and preparation for the coming season. Families maintained traditions, worked together to sustain settlements, and engaged in communal labor. Children learned practical and spiritual skills, while adults navigated trade, diplomacy, and defense. Life required constant adaptation, yet the continuity of seasonal cycles provided structure, comfort, and a sense of stability amidst external pressures. As night falls over the settlements, forts, and rivers of New France, imagine the quiet of a canoe drifting along a misty river. Fires glow softly along the riverbank, smoke curling into the cold night air. Voices, French, Algonquin, Huron, carry gently across the still waters. The wind whispers through the trees, and the stars shimmer above, reflected on the calm surface of lakes and rivers. The pulse of New France moves steadily, shaped by trade, diplomacy, agriculture, and the ever-present challenge of navigating the complex relations with the British colonies to the south. This chapter, focused on the growing British pressure, diplomacy with Indigenous nations, and the preparation for larger conflict, illustrates how New France navigated a precarious political and economic landscape. Fortifications, trade networks, alliances, and governance structures provided resilience and cohesion. Settlers, traders, and Indigenous nations collaborated to survive, thrive, and maintain influence across the continent. The colony's story was one of adaptation, diplomacy, and endurance, setting the stage for the major conflicts that would determine the fate of New France in the coming decades. The rivers and forests of New France had carried the colony through centuries of exploration, trade, and settlement. Canoes drifted silently across lakes, laden with furs, supplies, and travelers, connecting distant posts and villages. By the mid-18th century, the colony had expanded from the St. Lawrence Valley through the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi River, sustaining a network of communities that relied on trade, diplomacy, and the rhythms of the land. Yet even as life continued in its quiet, seasonal cycles, the shadow of war began to stretch across the colony, signaling profound change. Tensions with the British colonies had grown steadily. Competition for territory, trade, and alliances with Indigenous nations increasingly threatened French dominance in North America. Both powers sought to secure influence over trade routes and strategic locations, recognizing that the support of indigenous nations could determine the outcome of conflicts. French settlements, forts, and trading posts were positioned to defend the colony, while militias and indigenous allies patrolled forests, rivers, and lakes. Every river bend, every portage, and every trading post became a potential site of strategic significance in the growing contest between empires. The outbreak of the 7 Years' War in 1756 marked a turning point. Known in North America as the French and Indian War, this conflict pitted New France and its indigenous allies against British colonies and their indigenous partners. Battles unfolded along rivers, forests, and frontier settlements as both sides sought control of forts, trade networks, and key geographical locations. The war demanded immense coordination, strategy, and endurance as European officers, colonial militias, and indigenous warriors navigated dense forests, swift rivers, and harsh winters. Survival required knowledge, patience, and courage, as the land itself could be as formidable as any army. French strategy relied heavily on alliances with indigenous nations. The Huron-Wendat, Algonquin, Ottawa, and other nations provided guidance, intelligence, and manpower, ensuring that French forces could move effectively through the interior. Canoes carried warriors and supplies along rivers, while forests offered cover and mobility. Indigenous allies were not passive participants but active strategists, negotiating, advising, and fighting in ways that reflected their own interests and knowledge of the land. These alliances shaped the conduct of war and underscored the interdependence that had long sustained New France. Forts became critical in the defense of the colony. Strategic posts such as Fort Niagara, Fort Frontenac, and Fort Duquesne were fortified, supplied, and garrisoned with soldiers and militia. These forts served as hubs for communication, trade, and military operations, linking distant settlements and enabling rapid response to British advances. The fall of a fort could have ripple effects across the colony, disrupting trade, alliances, and military coordination. Each fortification represented both strength and vulnerability, a microcosm of New France's precarious position in a continent contested by empires. Trade, which had sustained New France for generations, became both a necessity and a vulnerability during the war. Fur routes, trading posts, and supply lines were monitored, defended, and, at times, disrupted. Canoes still carried pelts, tools, and provisions, but now they also carried messages, troops, and intelligence. Indigenous partners facilitated movement, negotiation, and reconnaissance, their knowledge of rivers, lakes, and forests proving invaluable. The interplay between commerce and strategy highlighted the complexity of sustaining a colony under the pressures of war and imperial competition. Settlements faced hardship as the conflict intensified. Fields, orchards, and livestock continued to provide sustenance, but resources were stretched to support military needs and fortifications. Families maintained daily routines, yet the presence of soldiers, the threat of raids, and the movement of troops added tension and uncertainty. Children continued to learn practical skills and religious instruction, while adults balanced labor, trade, defense, and diplomacy. Life remained structured around seasonal cycles, yet the rhythms of peace were increasingly interrupted by the demands of conflict. The war's turning point came in the capture of Quebec City by British forces in 1759. After a series of strategic maneuvers, battles, and sieges, British troops gained control of the city, a symbol of French authority in North America. The fall of Quebec disrupted trade, diplomacy, and military coordination, marking a decisive shift in the balance of power. Montreal followed in 1760, completing the British conquest of New France. Indigenous allies, trade networks, and settlements were forced to navigate a new political landscape. while French settlers faced the reality of governance under a different empire. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 formalized the transfer of New France to British control. The vast territory, once under French administration, became part of the British Empire. Indigenous nations negotiated new arrangements, sometimes maintaining alliances, trade, and autonomy, while settlers adjusted to British laws, governance, and cultural expectations. The landscape remained the same: rivers, forests, and lakes, but the political and social fabric had transformed. Life continued, but the rhythms of the colony now moved under a new authority, one that would influence the future development of Canada. Despite the fall of New France, the legacy of French settlement endured. Towns, forts, trade networks, and cultural practices continued to shape the landscape. French language, religion, and customs remained embedded in communities, influencing governance, culture, and daily life under British rule. Indigenous nations retained significant influence, negotiating new relationships and maintaining control over land, trade, and cultural traditions. The story of New France, with its exploration, trade, diplomacy, and resilience, continued to echo through rivers, forests, and settlements across the continent. Life adapted to the new order. Settlers continued to farm, hunt, and trade, guided by the rhythms of the land. Canoes still moved silently across lakes and rivers, carrying goods, messages, and travelers. Communities preserved traditions, religion, and cultural identity while learning to navigate British administration and policies. Indigenous nations adjusted alliances and trade networks, ensuring their survival and influence. The interplay of European and indigenous knowledge, skills, and culture continued to shape daily life, sustaining communities through a period of transformation and uncertainty. The natural world remained central to life. Rivers dictated travel and trade, forests provided shelter and resources, and wildlife followed seasonal patterns that guided hunting and sustenance. Canoes glided over misty waters at dawn, reflecting the sky and trees. Settlers tended fields, livestock, and homes, while indigenous nations navigated forests and rivers with expertise honed over generations. The land shaped behavior, culture, and survival, providing continuity amidst the upheaval of war, conquest, and political change. As night falls over former French settlements, imagine the quiet of the St. Lawrence and Great Lakes, of rivers winding through forests and valleys. Fires glow softly in homes and forts, smoke rising into the calm night air. Canoes drift at the water's edge, mist curling above still waters. Voices, French, English, Algonquin, Huron, and other nations, carry gently across the landscape. Stars shimmer above, mirrored in lakes and rivers. The pulse of New France, though altered by conquest, continues quietly in the land, waterways, and communities, a legacy of exploration, trade, diplomacy, and human resilience. This chapter, focused on the 7 Years' War and the fall of New France, illustrates how conflict, diplomacy, and adaptation reshaped the colony. Military strategy, indigenous alliances, trade networks, and settlement life were all central to survival. The transfer to British rule marked a profound change, yet the enduring legacy of French culture, knowledge, and settlement continued to influence the land and its people. Through resilience, adaptation, and connection to the natural world, the story of New France persisted, leaving a lasting imprint on the history of Canada. As the night deepens and the rivers of Canada flow silently beneath the moonlight, we have journeyed together through centuries of exploration, settlement, trade, and transformation. From the first indigenous nations who shaped the land with their knowledge and culture, through the arrival of European explorers, the rise and fall of New France, and the transition to British rule, Canada's story is one of resilience, adaptation, and the enduring connection between people and the land. Imagine the forests whispering their ancient secrets, the lakes reflecting starlight, and the echoes of history drifting softly across valleys and rivers. The stories of explorers, settlers, traders, and indigenous nations remind us that every place holds layers of life, memory, and human experience, waiting to be felt and remembered. As you drift deeper into sleep, let the quiet of Canada's vast landscapes, the rivers, forests, and mountains, carry you gently into dreams. The rhythm of history, the passage of time, and the calm of the natural world invite rest, reflection, and wonder. Thank you for joining this journey through time. If you found yourself lost in the flow of Canada's history, be sure to like, subscribe, and share so that more travelers can quietly explore the past under the moonlight. Until next time, let the gentle stories of the land guide your dreams.